So this morning, I'm going to talk about how you kind of jump over all the hurdles to get a research project off the ground. And I'm no expert, but I'll try to share some of the knowledge I've picked up from being involved in several different types of research study, as well as drawing on the vast wealth of experience in our own group. And I wanted to thank Chris, Danny, and Duncan, who made some suggestions for discussion points and give me some tips that they would share. This talk's going to have a bit of a UCL, UCLH, RCOA slant, but the same principles will apply if you're at a different institution. And I'll try and talk through things in kind of a logical linear order, but often a lot of these tasks that we're going to talk about are happening concurrently. Anyone feel free to chip in with their experiences, advice, or questions as we go through things. So when you're starting out, you'll have a research question that you'll then try and develop your study from. A good point at the early stages is to do the good clinical practice training, and that's available online through the NIHR and other different groups. And that kind of gives you a bit of an overview of the kind of different responsibilities and how you should conduct research. So that kind of the rights and safety of any participants are protected, and that any study is conducted in accordance with kind of good rigor and integrity. Often kind of developing the questions, the study design, the protocol, that takes it can take quite a bit of time. You might need to go through multiple processes. It's often a good point to get feedback from others, draw in collaborators, and there is kind of informal and formal options for peer review. So developing my study, there was lots of people that I drew in who kind of helped shape it. But you can also submit kind of your protocol to a committee within UCL who will kind of look at its merits, its methods, its feasibility, and give you feedback on that. You'll probably want to consider some whether you need patient and public involvement, especially if you're writing questionnaires, posters, or patient information sheets. And there's lots of options for this available to us. So within the Royal College of Anaesthetists, we've got the PCPI group, which is kind of a lay committee which will review study documents, particularly looking at kind of lay abstracts and any patient-facing materials. And I use them to give me some advice on my lay abstracts. But also within UCL, UCLH, the Biomedical Research Centre have lots of options where they do training, they offer advice, they also offer funding so that you can set up focus groups, and they have multiple kind of times per year where they offer that funding and that training. And you can also then kind of think of things like Ollie's priority setting partnership, the UCL challenges, different things that might, different themes that your research could fit in with, which also kind of help kind of sell it as being useful. And these, it's not necessarily one of the regulatory hurdles. You may not need to do it, but it's certainly kind of a hurdle that you will have to jump if if you're applying for funding from the NIHR or the MRC. Any of the big research funders expect you to do that. Funding itself is a big hurdle. We're lucky in that we have the clinical fellowships, but you may have research costs. For example, I had data costs. So it's often takes a couple of goes. And I think with each application, you're your project probably gets a bit better with kind of the feedback that you get. So you have to kind of think of that, I think, early on, because it can often take a bit of time to get that funding. And what I did was talk to people who've been successful, and looked at their applications and took their advice. So there's that option within the group. There's a few people who have successfully jumped that hurdle. And then the big one that we think about is ethics. So you want to think about your participants, how you're going to recruit them, include them, exclude them. What are you going to tell them about your research? Will you need to consent them? Are they able to withdraw their consent at any point during the trial? And then think about any risks. So you'll need to kind of think carefully if this is, even if this is just using patient data, there's risks of disclosure of patients being re-identified and the fallout from that. So what are you going to do to try and mitigate that risk? And then thinking of ways of how you're going to use your data. Are you going to publish it, present it? Is it going to be used for other projects? How will you kind of make the best use of this research? And they're all things that will kind of help with any kind of applications that you're making to funding bodies or ethics. And there'll be data access approvals as well. So, for example, if you're planning on using NIHR data or PQIT data, or like myself, CPRD, then there's kind of separate approval processes to go through for that, in addition to ethics. One of the sources of support and information that we have available to us is the UCL UCLH Joint Research Office, JRO, and they're based at Maple House, which is just beside UCLH on Tottenham Court Road. They offer kind of helpful training. There's a lot of information on their website. One of the really useful things is they have protocol templates. So if you're doing an observational trial, or you're doing a trial of using medicines or drugs, then they have templates that you can fill in. You don't necessarily need to use that template, but it will kind of guide you through a lot of the questions that you need to answer, and to make sure that kind of all the regulatory aspects are covered, and they've got quite clear guidelines. They'll arrange study sponsorships through UCL, UCLH, and that's kind of the sponsor is the person who's taking on the responsibility for kind of managing, financing, kind of ensuring the research. The JRO can be a bit difficult to pin down at times. I think emailing them often isn't the best option. If you can get the name of someone or pick up the phone and speak to them, that's often the best way to kind of get help with things. And then kind of the Health Research Authority is the body that is granting approval for kind of research to be undertaken within the NHS or on NHS patients. And I guess a really quite difficult question we have is this project research? And if it is, what approvals am I going to need? And there's quite a good decision tool on the MHRA website, which will kind of guide you through some questions to see whether you're going to need to get research ethics approval via the MHRA NHS route, or whether you could go through the University Academic Research Ethics Committee, or whether your study is actually a service evaluation or a clinical audit, and therefore doesn't need ethics. So that's a good starting point, is using that website tool. if you don't meet any of those decision points, then you can apply for ethical approval through UCL. So if you're not using, if you're not using a study that is looking at NHS patients or their tissue or the data, but you're going to kind of do your PhD project on another data set, then the UCL Ethics Committee have a couple of different options. They have kind of a high risk and a minimum risk option. So you can submit a kind of quite a brief form that is reviewed remotely by an ethics committee if it's minimal risk. They'll get back to you with a decision. Whereas, if it's deemed higher risk, then it's probably going to be a more lengthy process, a more lengthy form, and probably a discussion and meeting with them. If the MHRA decision tool directs you to say this is research and you'll need to get MHRA approval, then you're going to be using the integrated research, I always forget, application system called IRS. So that's the kind of the single portal for kind of applying for research approval. You set up a profile, and you can then create a project, and then it will give you kind of an option to decide what type of research you're doing, and depending on which filter you choose, that will kind of populate the online form with the questions. So you need to make sure that you're using the correct filter. So for example, if you're doing a drug trial and you don't select the right filter, then you'll miss out a lot of the questions that are required for the MHRA approvals. And this on the form, it's quite a detailed form, but I don't think you need to overthink the language or the science. They're really just trying to make sure that you're going to conduct this research safely, that you've given due care and attention to the methods, and they want to be able to kind of understand it, so make things kind of crystal clear. There's lots of little help boxes beside the questions that will give you more information about how you answer them and direct you to online guides and FAQs. Once you've kind of completed this form, it's often useful to kind of get other people to help you with it, and you can transfer the document between other people to review it or edit it. If you're doing a clinical trial, so for example, the Crown Coronation trial, there was a clinical trials unit, so a whole group of people who were working on populating this form and making sure that it met all the requirements. Whereas if you're doing this yourself, it can take a while to get it all completed and get it sounding right. So factor in that time. Then you have to kind of factor in the time of when you're going to book in a slot with the Research Ethics Committee, and they've got an online booking service on their website. And once you've booked a slot, you may have an option. Sometimes there's specific types of study or types of research that will be flagged to certain committees. So you may just be given one option, or you may be able to choose. And once you've booked that, then you can submit the IRS application form and any kind of supporting documents on the same day. On the date of the meeting, the committee is looking at multiple applications. They'll give yours an initial review, and then they'll kind of invite you into the meeting. This is all being done kind of virtually at the minute, so they give you a kind of a time, and then we'll kind of let you into the Zoom call or whatever they're using. And there they might have some questions, concerns, and you'll be invited to kind of give an overview of your project and kind of answer those questions about the science and methodology. It's important really to kind of know your project inside out, so that you kind of inspire that confidence and reassurance that you know your project and you know your protocols well. And there'll often be you're allowed to bring other people into the meeting with you. So you might want to bring a PhD supervisor or members of the trials unit to kind of assist with answering any questions. They'll usually then get back to you within kind of 2 weeks with kind of either a favorable or an unfavorable opinion, or perhaps a provisional opinion where they've set some conditions or said go off and look at that and get back to us. There are other options kind of within kind of the ethics approval of accessing confidential patient information, and that's kind of referred to as Section 251 as part of the NHS Act, and this is where you want to access patient information without their consent. So there's a group called the Confidential Advisory Group, or CAG, that are kind of set up to kind of protect the public and patients from us accessing all their data. But they also want to, they also know that sometimes consent can't be obtained. So perhaps, for example, with deceased patients, and you may want to kind of look at kind of longer term outcomes within a data set, such as hospital episode statistics or mortality data from the Office of National Statistics. So the CAG will kind of facilitate the approval for that. And they have kind of a list of kind of categories of research where this kind of issue is coming up again and again, so that can kind of be fast-tracked. Whereas if it's a bit more complex, then it's often useful to have a discussion with them to work out whether this would be kind of viable, and then there's an application form to fill in for that. Amendments are something that often creep up. So after you've got your ethical approval and you're trying to get your study off the ground, there may be things that you encounter, problems that make that weren't kind of in your original protocol or ethical plan. So you need to go back and submit an amendment to get approval from the committee. And these kind of fall into kind of substantial and non-substantial. So kind of a non-substantial would be anything that doesn't affect the kind of safety of subjects in your study, or change the scientific value or the conduct or management. And that's usually a bit more of a more simple process where you can fill in a form and liaise with the JRO or your trials unit to submit that, and the committee will make a decision remotely. Whereas substantial amendment is where kind of there is going to be a significant change to what you're doing, and that is again a kind of in a more detailed form and process, and often a discussion with them. Often with all these things, it's easier to have a discussion with someone to get a bit of an idea of how things work and the best way to proceed. So throughout the process, from kind of submitting your application, there'll be a contact that you can email or speak to on the phone to get more information. And I've mentioned the MHRA, who review any kind of clinical trial of an investigational medicinal product, so drug trials, or any trials using medical devices. So if you doing any of those, there will be kind of a separate form that appears within IRAS that is kind of populated and that you need to complete, that also gets submitted. So you'll have kind of two streams of approvals. You'll have the Research Ethics Committee, MHRA approval, and then after that, the MHRA will sign off on it. So there'll be another kind of round of possibly meetings and kind of revisions to your plans. I think, as you can see, there's lots of tasks, lots of plate spinning, and it's really quite time consuming. So when I think of my study, it's taken 2 years to kind of go from research question in spring summer 2018 to getting my data in spring summer 2020. And part of that is funding. So I had several goes at trying to get funding, but also unexpected things. So when I was initially starting out, I wanted to link lots of different data sets, but GDPR just arrived, so no one was really entertaining any discussion about sharing data, because they were all trying to get their houses in order and make sure that their processes were compliant. So that did delay things, and then the pandemic this year kind of delayed things as different bodies were prioritizing COVID-19 research instead. So there will be lots of unexpected things, but you need to kind of factor in that it's going to take some time. So think about your timelines, plan out the various stages, and then double it or add some time to it, and think of kind of useful things that you can be doing in between. So once you've submitted your application, you could be waiting around for a few weeks, few months. So think of other projects or things that you could do to prepare for your project in that time. These are kind of complicated kind of pathways, so it's often useful to discuss, as I mentioned early on, with kind of any regulatory bodies, and they can give you kind of an idea before you've even started filling in the forms of whether your ideas are going to be feasible. Other kind of challenges are if you're running a study over multiple sites. So if you're not based on that site, you don't know the people, you're going to need to find someone locally who can kind of champion your project, help kind of navigate the bureaucracy. So that's something that's been done quite well with PQIP, where there are local PIs who will deal with their hospitals' approvals processes through R&D, rather than you doing it centrally. And I think you have to be resilient through this process and don't be disheartened. I like the I've forgotten the name of the academic. There's an academic in, I think, North America, who has a CV of his failures, where he lists out all the things that he's applied for and didn't get. And certainly with all these hoops, there is a bit of kind of trial and error, and with each kind of iteration, making it a bit better, and eventually successfully jumping the hurdles. And I think there's a wealth of kind of knowledge and experience within our group. So anyone who is starting out, speak to other fellows. Someone usually knows the answer or can point you in the direction of someone who can. If you can join a project that has ethics or approvals already set up, there are a lot of research groups that are quite good at kind of, while one person's running a study, they're also getting the next project set up. So they're doing all the IRS and funding applications for the next fellow who's kind of coming behind them and run that project. So they're not kind of using a significant chunk of their time on a program getting a project approved and off the ground. And I think that's probably all I want to talk about. I'm happy to take any questions or tips and advice from other people who have had experience of this.